Hi everyone, me again. Thanks once more for coming and watching my video. I'm very happy to see you here. Today, once again, we are going to be starting with a little story. And just like when I did this last time in my passing video, I'm going to pause just after the story and I'd like you to just jot down what you think about this particular situation. Last time I tried this, I got some really interesting responses, so I'd be curious to see what you put in this video. So in this situation, I'm going back about a year and a half or so ago, before I'd started coming out widely at work and before I'd made it widely known that I'm transgender myself. And I was talking to a colleague because he was talking about somebody he was working with in his own day-to-day work. And this other person that he was talking about was transgender. And he wasn't using the preferred pronouns of this other person. So I asked him to do that, because even if that transgender person isn't around us in this space, it's respectful and the right thing to do. And then we got into a conversation about why he wasn't really willing or able to do so. And I found it really interesting because it seemed from his perspective, if he gave in to using the pronouns of this transgender woman, he was somehow engaging and reinforcing in some form of deceptive behavior, that by calling her she, somehow he was leaving himself open to be deceived, to be made a fool of perhaps, and that he didn't want any part of this. He didn't want to be calling this woman she or her, because in his view there was the possibility that she was lying to him about it. And also he said, what if this person's wrong? Am I not just potentially just reinforcing some misconception that they have about themselves? Have you considered that? I don't want to make them more confused than they already are. I'm going to pause there and I'd like you to put in the comment section what you think about this interaction. What do you think? How do you think you would have responded? And do you think that he has a point in what he was saying? Okay, so welcome back. I hope that you've written your comment, and I'll be very curious to see what you've said, and I'll be responding if I can and if I have time. In this video, I'm going to be talking a little bit about this specific trope of transphobia. Don't worry, or don't get too excited if you hear the word transphobia and you think I'm going to start pointing the finger of cancellation at various individuals. I'm going to make a video about my perspective of the usage of the word transphobia, and I want to try to balance that out a little bit, to make it a little bit more nuanced than the clash of the word transphobia that we see in the narrative of today. But let's just put that to one side for a moment. So I'm going to be focusing on the trope of deceit, transgender people as deceivers. So in this video, I'm going to cover three main topics. I'm going to talk about where this trope comes from. I'm going to talk about where do we see evidence of this in the world. And I'm going to talk about the impact of this on the lives of trans folks. So starting from the top, and we're going to talk about where it comes from. Now, I'm a big fan of history, and I think a lot of what we see today, we can look back and find echoes of this throughout history. And I'm going to touch a little bit on the history of anti-Semitism, because I see a lot of the trope of deception having roots perhaps in the anti-Semitic movements. Going all the way back to 1543, Martin Luther, who you might know as the start of the Reformation and Lutheranism, he wrote a paper called On Jews and Their Lies, which is perhaps the first place where these ideas were captured on paper, and you can potentially draw a line from that paper all the way through to the anti-Semitic movements of the 1940s, tied up with the idea of Jewish people being deceivers and somehow trying to push an agenda into society at large. You've got examples of things like the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, and we've got the Dreyfus Affair in 1895. So the idea that a minority group is somehow surreptitiously and sneakily spreading these lies and rumours to try to broaden a kind of agenda, this goes back centuries within the sphere of anti-Semitism, but we can see how these lies become endemic within a cultural discourse and narrative, and how that becomes a perceived truth that just gets reinforced and repeated ad nauseum. I mean, we can still see people referring to things like the Protocols of the Elders of Zion today and using that as evidence of anti-Semitic ideas and thoughts, despite the fact it was debunked as a fraudulent piece of work, even when it was released. So it's very difficult to really kill these lies at source. You have to work really hard to try to get through them and to get past them. But what about trans folk in particular? What is it about us that makes us the targets of people calling us deceptive and saying that we are not to be trusted? Well, some research seems to suggest that perhaps it's the very basis of the fact that we're transgender, the fact that we are moving from one identity to the other, the idea that perhaps we're confused and we don't really understand who we are, and that kind of blurring of how we present ourselves, it creates that sense of distrust. Who are you trying to be? Who are you trying to present yourself as? And I can show examples of this in my comments section where people are visibly confused or frustrated by the fact that I'm just not appearing female enough. So moving on to the second point that I wanted to talk about is, where do we see further evidence of this? And I think it's quite clear. We all know, and we've all probably seen some of the examples of this in wider media. Silence of the Lambs is an obvious example where you've got the not transgender individual in the film, the main bad guy being chased by everybody, by Clarice Starling, despite the fact the movie has a line where they say that he's not transgender. It's quite clear that there is that sort of subtext there, and so we're perceived as this kind of deceptive force. Sorry, the window keeps slamming if there's some smashing noises in this video. So we're seen as this kind of deceptive force using our transgenderism as a means to an end, and that end is always bad and violent. Similarly, we've got Ace Ventura, Pet Detective, where once again a transgender person is shown as a deceiver, as somebody who wants to push some kind of personal agenda whilst lying about their status. And of course, you've also got the famous movie The Crying Game, which is very similar. So there's this trope repeated throughout media that we are this deceptive kind of person. And not just that, you see kind of these things echoing throughout a lot of the narratives when it comes to discussions about transgender people in society at large. It taps into that notion of trans people in sports, that we're only interested in getting involved in sports because we want to use our superior physical prowess to dominate female sports. It's always female sports, by the way. Trans men are somehow ignored through a lot of these narratives, which is, again, deeply unfair, because if I'm a deceiver, then my trans male brothers are equally deceptive as well, no? That means neither of us are, by the way, just to be clear. There's this notion that we're somehow out to get people, and that gets pulled through into discussions about whether or not we should be allowed into male spaces if we're trans male or female spaces if we're trans female. Somehow, by us being in those locations, we're not just there to use the bathroom, we're there for some kind of evil intent because we want to do something bad. I think it is entirely clear what those bad things are, but the instances of that happening are vanishingly small, so the evidence of this just doesn't bear fruit, yet this idea persists, and I see this repeated throughout the comments section of my videos. This idea is also supported in research, and I found a very interesting study from 2021 which discusses this very idea, that trans people and trans women in particular are seen as deceptive and liars. So this idea has really implanted itself into the subconsciouses, at least of people, and I see this idea repeated again and again throughout my own comment section, and I'll put up a few choice examples of this here on the screen now. So what's the impact of this on the lives of trans folk? Because of course, if you're labelled and perceived as deceptive and as a liar, well, that's not good. That's a really bad starting point. If the first thing that people see about you is firstly that you are a trans person, then you're going to be viewed through that lens, through that filter of what has society told you about trans folk? What do you know about trans folk? And so if you've been watching films like The Crying Game and Ace Ventura and all of that good stuff, your starting point is probably, well, watch out for this trans person because they're going to lie to you. And the impact on that is absolutely real. I mean, for me, that kind of self-understanding that I'm transgender, it was really difficult to square that with that media and cultural idea of deception, because I don't see myself, I don't want to be a liar. But by the same token, it gave me a barrier to start coming out, because if I know that people are going to start thinking of me as someone who's deceptive, then am I going to have to justify my transness? Are they going to take me at face value? Are they going to believe the things that I say? And again, I can see this echoed throughout my comment section. People find it very difficult to believe. When I say I'm a transgender woman, they will bend over backwards to try to prove to me that I'm not. And for me, this is an example of them not believing me, of me being perceived as a deceiver. They won't believe me. It's wild. I talk about it all the time. I'm a transgender woman. But no, I'm not a transgender woman, because based on this 15-minute video, you are this other thing, which is just, it's quite interesting, really. I don't find it upsetting. It's just bananas as far as I'm concerned. And there's this constant sense, I suppose, of having to prove yourself to other people. I guess this taps into that I need to try to almost hyper-feminize myself or hyper-masculinize myself if I'm a trans male, because this is the only way that I can show to the world that I am who I say I am. I have to be an extreme version of a woman, but then that loops back into that idea that I touched on again in the passing video, that people will use that as a weapon against you because you are falling into the tropes of what a woman is or isn't. You're wearing dresses because you want to try to do this, but you can't reduce womanhood to long hair, for example, as somebody said in one of my recent videos. And no, you can't, but you have to use these gender identifiers and signifiers in order to try to show that you are a trans woman, in my case, because people won't believe you, apparently, otherwise. But this is just a personal experience, and the implications are much wider and much deeper and much more serious than this, of course. I talked about the trans in sports debate, and it basically meant that so many hundreds and thousands of girls and boys are being denied access to sports. And sports are essential to things like mental health, physical health, building that sense of teamwork and integration with other people. If trans people are removed from that experience, then that means we're necessarily being isolated from a very important part of that socialization and integration into society. People can't accept us as being integrated into society if we can't even be integrated into sports, one of the most basic things that humans engage in. It might sound pretty silly and inconsequential. Oh, well, trans people just don't need to participate in sports. But actually, sports play a fairly central role in my life, and I'd imagine in the lives of most people in the world. And by denying trans folk this space and this opportunity, you're basically removing a part of their humanity. And it's not just sports that trans folk have difficulty accessing, there's also healthcare. Doctors might also have it in the back of their mind, oh, this trans person that's talking to me about their medical issues, well, how do I know they're telling me the truth? How do I know they're not just trying to get some kind of medication or prescription? I'll just maybe play it safe this time, whereas with a cis person, they would be much more happy to give that person some kind of medication or to be listening more carefully to when they're talking about their symptoms. And of course, I mentioned spaces as well, and it's not just about bathrooms, but other spaces too. If your first instinct is that this trans woman is out to harm me and they're going to be somehow deceptive, then nobody's going to feel safe in that space. No one's going to feel welcome in that space, and everybody loses at the end of the day. And there's this weird kind of double blind, double bind kind of experience, and this was discussed in this very old article that I was able to find through the Wayback Machine, and I thought it was a really interesting analysis of how, on the one hand, trans folk are seen as this kind of deceptive, almost cartoonishly evil collective, but on the other hand, we're also able to trick and fool people through getting away with hiding and being stealth. So on the one hand, people can see us and they can see our transness, but on the other hand, if we try to go under the radar and not be open about our transness, then we also face consequences of that one if we ever get unmasked. Trans folk often face significant amounts of violence, even being unalived by others because, oh, they've been unmasked as trans, you were trying to somehow deceive me, you're trying to turn me gay or something like this. And again, that's a huge problem, because as a trans person, you're kind of living on this knife edge where on the one hand you want to be authentic and real, but then by doing that you're facing the prejudices of the wider world. So if you then try to be a bit more hidden about it, you're then being accused of being a deceiver, and it taps into that trope. I mean, nobody's going to go into a room and just declare their cisness or their sexuality the first thing they do. I'm not going to walk around with a badge saying, hi, I'm Andy, I am trans, because nobody does that. And it's unrealistic of people to think that's what trans folks should do. But it's almost like that's part of the expectation. That's part of what we're being told to do. We have to declare our transgender nature to others. Otherwise, we're deceiving them. Anyway, I just wanted to touch on this, and I've only really been able to give a very narrow and small window into this trope, but I think it's a very interesting topic, and it's going to be much more than a 15-minute or however long this video is to do this complete justice. This is just a summary of the things that I've seen, that I've read over the last few weeks. I hope that you found it interesting, and I hope for you folk who aren't trans have seen this and it's maybe triggered a few ideas and a few thoughts on this matter. Do please write your ideas and thoughts in the comments section, and we can have a much broader and deeper conversation about this there. I've really enjoyed having those conversations with people who are maybe questioning of my status, and I think a lot of the time I might not get through to them entirely. Sometimes I think it does at least trigger questions. And it triggers questions in me as well. It's very interesting learning about the perspectives of everybody who comes and watches my videos, and I really appreciate everything that people have to say. There's things that I've gone away and reflected on, and I was talking about the use of the word transphobe earlier, and I'm going to make a video about that because I think it's triggered an idea in my own head about language, and I think it's worthwhile having that conversation. So look forward to seeing that one very soon. Okay, thank you very much for watching this video. As I say, I hope you found it useful and informative, and I will see you around next time. Take care. Bye-bye.